Good afternoon, learners, and welcome to today's session. This is a session for students of MA English, specifically for the course MEG-19, the Australian Novel. I'm Dr. Malathy A, and I coordinate this course. So what I'd like to do in today's session is, basically, we had conducted a session previously on the same course. We had covered certain aspects of the course there. So I'd like to reflect on the points that we had raised in the previous session, then go on to attempt a brief overview of the Australian novel till the mid-20th century, and then attempt a critical survey of major themes and concerns of the Australian novel till the mid-20th century. So that is what I hope to achieve in today's session. So as you would know, the novel is a specifically European genre of literature, and it arose in Europe during a particular point of time in a particular context. And it was brought to Australia by the settler communities. And in a previous session, we had looked at the specific context in which the novel as a genre took shape in Australia. So the kinds of questions we raised in that session were: how did the novel take shape in Australia? What were the specific contexts in which it arose? What directions did the novel take in Australia? How did Australian novelists innovate and experiment with the form of the novel? What specific themes did Australian novelists engage with? So these were some of the questions that we asked, that we raised in the previous session, and we tried to answer these. So we initiated a discussion on the Australian novel in that session, which I would like to continue today and in later sessions as well. As you would know, there are 8 blocks in this course which are dedicated to different phases, to certain landmarks in the history of Australian novel. Though it had very rudimentary beginnings in the early 19th century, the novel as a form has developed in Australia. Now we have Patrick White, the Nobel Prize laureate, and several Booker Prize winners like Peter Carey and Thomas Keneally, then several others who were nominated for the Booker Prize. I'm not saying that winning awards and prizes is a criterion for the quality of a writer, but it shows that Australian literature, the novel in Australia, has gained global acclaim and recognition. So, continuing from the point where we left off the discussion in the previous session, where we had sort of identified the situation in which the novel took shape in Australia. We looked at the particular confluence of social and cultural factors, the rise of universities, lending libraries, etc. in Australia, which led to a very strong reading culture and print culture, and that was the context in which the novel took shape in Australia. And we discussed some of the main aspects of the novel in its early stages. Now, coming to today, we will be covering roughly the period up to the mid-1950s. So, a critic on the novel form, Christine Moffat, identifies 5 broadly chronological and overlapping literary themes in Australian novel, and these are encounters, settlement, social, moral and political agendas, cultural nationalism, and interior lives. So these are the themes that Christine Moffat has identified as dominating or preoccupying many of the authors or many of the novelists of Australia up to the period roughly the mid-1950s. So I found this a very useful way of understanding the development of the Australian novel in the early half up to the second half of the 20th century. So I'd like to follow that pattern of discussion today. So the encounters, by encounters she means the encounters between the white settlers and the Aboriginal peoples. Settlement, of course, Australia is a settler colony, and settlement would naturally be a major theme for writers. Social, moral and political agendas, cultural nationalism, which is a very important theme for the early half of the 20th century, because that is the time when Australia became a nation. What was earlier a collection, a loose gathering of colonies, becomes one single nation in the early half of the 20th century. And interior lives, the inner lives of characters. So these are the broad themes that we will be discussing today. So when you talk about the encounters between Aboriginal peoples and settlers, you must be knowing that there have been very violent encounters in which large sections of Aboriginal peoples were completely annihilated. In fact, an Aboriginal scholar, Deborah Rose, says that Australian settlement was a euphemism for a Holocaust. She likens it to the Holocaust, where large numbers of Aboriginal peoples were simply wiped out. So an important point to be noted here is that up to 1950s, novelists were primarily from the white settler community, because the first Aboriginal novelist is from the second half of the 20th century. So this is very significant in understanding the development of the novel in the first half of the 20th century. So there is a very strong Eurocentric element in the writing of these novels. Since the writers were all predominantly from the white settler communities, there is a strong Eurocentric color to the fiction of this period. So Aboriginal peoples are almost totally excluded from the early fiction. You find that there are several strategies used to almost completely erase Aboriginal people and their cultures from the fictional purview. They are hardly ever there in the fiction. And if at all they are there, it is a very marginal or peripheral presence. In fact, there are some writers who have touched upon the lives of Aboriginal peoples in the mid-19th century, like James Tucker in Ralph Rashley, written in 1850, or W.H. Leigh, author of The Emigrant, A Tale of Australia, published in 1847. But these writers are in the manner of Fenimore Cooper in American literature, who wrote that classic American novel, The Last of the Mohicans, view the Aboriginal peoples in a somewhat romanticized light. There are some writers who have viewed Aboriginal culture as problematic, as people creating issues and problems for the white settlers. And there have been, of course, rare exceptions to such biased views of Aboriginal culture. But when you look at the Australian novel till the mid-20th century, it practically erases the Aboriginal people from the ambit of fiction. So some writers who have taken a more positive view towards Aboriginal people are Rosa Praed, who shows us some kind of guilt regarding the way settler communities have behaved towards Aboriginals. You find this coming up later in poets like Judith Wright, who very clearly write about the guilt and who apologize for the wrongs done by white settlers to the Aboriginals. Then Catherine Martin in The Incredible Journey, published in 1923, that is a story told from the viewpoint of an Aboriginal mother. And Catherine Susannah Pritchard, a very prominent woman novelist of the early 20th century, who in the novel Coonerdoo also presents a specifically Aboriginal point of view and protests against the exploitation of Aboriginals by European settlers. One very significant work that shows projects the view that white settlers have wronged the Aboriginals is Capricornia by Xavier Herbert, published in 1938. So these are some aspects which we have to remember while discussing the encounters between Aboriginal peoples and the white settlers. Then we come to the next point, which is settlement. Of course, settlement has been a major theme. Since it was a settler culture, it had to be a crucial theme for Australian writers. And it dominates pre-1950 Australian fiction. So the responses of white settlers to the new continent and their attempts to build a home there dominate the writing of this period. So a very common narrative of settlement is the convict novel. As you know, Australia began as a convict settlement. Originally, several convicts were brought from England, and they were put into convict settlements here. And this background, this history of the continent as a convict settlement is reflected in the writing as well. So several of the early novels were convict novels. In fact, the very first novel to be written in Australia was Henry Savery's Quintus Servinton. Quintus Servinton, a tale founded upon incidents of real occurrence, published in 1830. It is in the form of a memoir, and it gives details about the conviction and transportation of Quintus and his harsh experiences as a convict. So this theme you find again in novels like James Tucker's Ralph Rashleigh, which we have already mentioned, published in 1845, which was again a scathing indictment of the brutality of the convict system. And perhaps the most famous of the convict novels, and which is considered a classic of 19th century Australian literature, is Marcus Clarke's For the Term of His Natural Life, published in 1874. It was a well-researched novel which touches upon several aspects of the convict system and the brutalities, the way the character Rufus Dawes, who was wrongly convicted he was convicted for a wrong that for something he had not committed, and the brutal experiences that he undergoes. This novel is considered is one of the most significant achievements of Australian fiction during the 19th century. Then again, Rolf Boulderwood in the novel Robbery Under Arms, published in 1888, is another classic of colonial literature which engages with the convict theme again, but it also introduces some very key tropes in Australian fiction, such as the outlawed bush ranger and the larrikin. These are terms which you would have come up in several times in your readings of the novels. The outlaw is a character that is a recurring character. In another novel that we study later in this course, Peter Carey's The True History of the Kelly Gang, this theme of the outlaw is discussed in detail, and the significance of this theme for Australian culture. Then there have been female convict novels as well by writers like Caroline Leakey, The Broad Arrow, published in 1859, which shows a somewhat sympathetic treatment of a female convict. And again, Eliza wants Lee's Her Natural Life, as opposed to his natural life. Her Natural Life, Tale of the 1830s, published in 1876. Again, a very sympathetic treatment of the female convict. So the convict novel is a very, very significant component of Australian fiction in the first half of the in the 19th as well as the early 20th centuries. Another very important theme is that of the successful and enterprising pioneer. So the pioneering experience, of course, since it was a settler colony, the pioneering experience is very, very significant here. And the theme of migration and the successful and hardworking hero is very common in early in the pre-1950s novel. Alexander Harris's Settlers and Convicts offers an ethic of hard work leading to success. So this was a work ethic that contrasted very much with the Aboriginal approach to the land. And that is what made the settlers see the Aboriginals as not being the owners of the land, because they did not work hard on the land. Then Charles Rowcroft's Tales of the Colonies or Adventures of an Immigrant again has a hero who succeeds through perseverance and hard work. Henry Kingsley, brother of an equally famous novelist Charles Kingsley, his recollection of Geoffrey Hamlin also focuses on this idea of a hardworking settler pioneer. So all these novels had a very masculinist tone. They idealized masculine protagonists who work hard on the land and work the land with their sweat and toil. So this is a very significant aspect of the pioneer and settler novel, the predominant tone of masculinity. And so scenes of activities such as bush ranging, then clearing the bush, cattle mustering, etc. were very common in all these novels. Again, industry and enterprise are themes celebrated by all these novels, and the heroic male whose toil, sweat and endurance lead to success is celebrated everywhere. So here, this is where we come across the famous theme of mateship, which provided some companionship for the people who worked on the land. Then some women writers were also preoccupied with the settlement theme, and they mostly wrote about the challenges of the domestic challenges that the women from the settler community had to face. So these include Louisa Atkinson's Gertrude the Emigrant, Catherine Helen Spencer's Clara Morrison, all of which depict the life of women in the colonies. They were mostly set in rural areas, but occasionally you ventured into the urban areas as well. And so these novels reflect many aspects of settler discourse, which a significant part of which was the relationship with the land. So the settler community generally saw the land as something that was hostile to them, something which they had to control. So you find this metaphors of domination, of controlling, of manipulation, of conquest coming up again and again in such writings. And this contrasts very much with the Aboriginal relationship with the land, the sense of interconnectedness that the Aboriginal peoples had with the land. You have Marcus Clarke's famous quote, "In Australia alone is to be found the grotesque, the weird, the strange scribblings of nature." So this shows a community that was unable to come and make sense of the new land. So one of the primary tasks of the Australian novelist was to find a new language, a new idiom of appreciation, a new way of relating to the land, a land which seemed so resistant to the kinds of language, to the literary terms, to the aesthetic practices, to the discursive practices that they brought from Europe. So that was one of the earliest tasks that the Australian novelist had to face. Then you have strategies such as terra incognita, that the land was it did not belong to anyone, and that it was an empty land, tabula rasa. These were all strategies used by European settlers to establish control over the new land. The idea of Australia as the antipodes or the upside down land, and then the view of Australian natural environment as grotesque, as weird, then myths of the outback, the never, the city and the bush. All of these were attempts by the settler community to establish control over the land. In fact, a lot of research has been done to show that how the settler discourse used several perceptual constructs such as picturesque aesthetics as well as cartographic concepts to establish ownership over the Australian land. So all these ideas, all these concepts you find reflected in settler writing as well, in the novels of the settler period. So the next point is about that social and political agendas in fiction. So there have been novelists who tried to look for a morally pure society through their writings, through primarily a religious and moral agenda. Writers who had a religious and moral agenda to transform individuals and thereby society. Their targets primarily were alcoholism and drunkenness, which were quite common in the settler communities. And there were writers who aimed for a just society through political propaganda. So some of these early 20th century writers particularly were socialist writers like Catherine Susanna Pritchard, and who protested the exploitations that they found in the society around them, and tried to aim at a more just society. And feminist quest for autonomy. This was a very significant aspect that came up in the early 20th century. So women writers, women novelists had this agenda of seeking autonomy and liberty for women, and to promote the idea that self-actualization is most important for women. So you have, as early as 1898, Ada Cambridge satirized the conventional femininity of some of her characters in the novel Mater Familias. But it was a classic in this category is My Brilliant Career, which you have to study in your course, by Miles Franklin. So this is a novel about Sibylla Melvin, who privileges her ambition to be a writer over her marriage. Then, here Miles Franklin represents the limited and grim lives of women of the white settler community, and Sibylla emerges as an early feminist who tries to go beyond the restricted lives prescribed for the women in settler society. So, Miles Franklin's novel is celebrated as an early feminist text for exactly these reasons. So Sibylla Melvin is an early feminist heroine who unfortunately fails in forging her brilliant career. That is what the novel is all about. So though she privileges her writing career, though she refuses marriage and prefers to take up a writing career instead, she is unable to build up a brilliant career. That is what the novel is all about. And she becomes an archetypal feminist figure, and who she, by opposing the social tendency to create women who reflected the ideals of their husbands, she refuses to participate in the patriarchal structures of colonial society. So this is, now we come to the next point, which is cultural nationalism and inner lives. So this, you must be knowing that there was this political move towards federation started in Australia in the late 1880s, and this was ultimately it led to the creation of the Australian nation in 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, which united the 6 existing colonies. And the several writers wrote novels that supported this idea of nationalism. And perhaps again, My Brilliant Career, which ends on that kind of note. You must be knowing how Sibylla, the novel ends on a very nationalistic note. This is one of the prime examples of these nationalistic novels. So cultural nationalism, the feeling that Australian writing should be authentic, should be a voice of the Australian land, or a voice of the Australian people, and not borrowed from some Eurocentric, and should not have a European base to it. That was reflected in the writings of the nationalist novels, among whom you have Miles Franklin, then Henry Lawson, etc. Then when you come to inner lives, you have writers like Christina Stead and Patrick White, who moved away from realism and tried to explore the inner lives of their characters and give a new dimension to the Australian novel. So you have Patrick White's famous statement that the novel should not be the product of a dreary, dun-coloured, the offspring of journalistic realism. And Patrick White aimed at discovering the extraordinary behind the ordinary and give his fiction, I quote, the textures of music, the sensuousness of paint. Probably a beautiful statement of the modernist aims that he had in his writing. As you know, Patrick White was a colossus in Australian literature. He wrote plays, novels, autobiography, then essays, poetry, but he's perhaps best remembered for his novels. And he established a model that several writers, he was almost all the writers, all the novelists who came after Patrick White owed a lot to him. So these are the main topics that, the main themes that writers up to the mid-1950s dealt with. We talked about encounters between Aboriginals and settlers, then settlement themes, then cultural nationalism, social and moral political agendas, and the inner lives of people who view society rather than being viewed by society. So I'd like to end on this note. We will continue this discussion, especially the writing of Patrick White, in another session. Thank you.